Welcome, English 11. I'd like to start out this video by posing you a simple question. What does this movie, which is Star Wars, specifically this is the latest one in the saga, The Force Awakens, but you can really use any Star Wars movie for this question, besides the prequels, of course, because they're all a steaming pile of garbage, which we can all agree upon. But anyway, what does Star Wars have in common with this movie, which is Office Space, 1999 comedy? Any ideas? Are there any thematic similarities? Are they intended to have the same reaction from the audience, or are they completely different? Don't really have much in common. Well, that's kind of the point. I mean, there are some broad archetypes that they'll share, but in general, these are two very different kinds of storytelling, right? Star Wars is a romantic epic. It's very similar to The Last of the Mohicans, The Leatherstocking Tales, which were incredibly popular books during the Romantic era, about heroes who rise from humble beginnings to do the right thing and to face daunting odds and terrifying villains to save people, to save innocent people. Office Space, on the other hand, is a depiction in a very satiric way of everyday life, the dreariness of everyday life, the dreariness of a dead-end job that means nothing, absolutely nothing to you, of having a boss who is irritating and you can't stand to be around, which is Bill Lumbergh in the movie. And I wanted to use these movies because I think they highlight in a helpful way the major shift that happens as Romanticism dies out and a new movement takes its place in the 1860s. So that takes us to our next topic this year, which is realism. Realism began, and these are approximate dates. There's really no specific year that we can look at as like, oh, this is when realism began, but approximately 1865, end of the Civil War, and going up until World War I, in which realism sort of shifts into a different mode, which we'll eventually get to. You can even tell from the way that art has evolved, whereas Romanticism was, not surprisingly, these very idealized portraits of nature and landscapes, and idealized depictions of workers and the quote-unquote the common man. In realism, we're seeing, well, first of all, a move towards more photorealistic depictions of the world, and we're seeing some less glamorous sides of life. Not everything is romantic. Not everything is idealized. And by the way, if the guy right here in this picture on the right-hand side, the beard looks like Cousin Mose from The Office, I think that you're right. Clearly a anachronistic reference to Cousin Mose from The Office. So, hope you picked up on that. Okay, so just like all of these movements, we need to take a look at, well, where did they come from? Why did they begin? And not surprisingly, one of the main causes of realism was the Civil War itself. Okay, and as you know from your history classes, this war was expected to be sort of quick and painless. The first major battle of the war, people who were living nearby showed up with picnic baskets to watch the battle, and then when it turned into a bloodbath and they ran away screaming, well, that was the start of the realization maybe this wasn't going to be so fun. It drags out for 4 long years. It's the deadliest conflict in American history. That's the ripple effect, the way that the violence and the loss ripples out into society. Those effects are long lasting and completely traumatic. By the end of the war, really, there's sort of the early indications of what World War I is going to be like. There's some early versions of trench warfare, really. So if you know anything about the siege of Petersburg and the Battle of the Crater, um, very very similar to the type of warfare that would take place decades later. Um, but again, it's dispiriting to the country. You have the South, which is in absolute ruins, and then the North is, of course, not destroyed like the South was, but of course, when you think about the casualties that mounted after 4 years of war, it's truly horrific. And the other thing about this war is that it's really the first photographed war. A guy named Matthew Brady went around to many of the battles and photographed the aftermath. So for the first time, people who are many miles away from the battlefields are actually seeing the carnage and the violence and the loss. They're not seeing it years later in a romanticized, idealized painting that someone makes. This is real, and it shocks everyone. It shocks the American public. So, not surprisingly, those idealized versions of humanity and of human nature that the Romanticists had, they're not really answering people's questions anymore. They seem out of touch. They seem disconnected from reality. And I think that that's always been a criticism of Romanticism. I mean, that's, I guess, sort of the point of Romanticism. But, when you're coming out of the other end of a horrific war, suddenly these ideas just aren't as appealing as they once were. And here's a photograph from Gettysburg, the Matthew Brady photograph. And again, these are the images that got out, and people started to realize that things were way worse than they probably could have imagined. After the war, American society changes at a very rapid pace. There's a lot of economic expansion. The Transcontinental Railroad is built, which starts to, in some ways, unify the country and speed up the flow of commerce. We start to see immigration pick up, massive increase in immigration, as well as giant corporations, which became, as you might expect, sort of instantly corrupt. So that does lead to a lot of economic inequality during this period. We eventually get the name the Gilded Age for this time period, where, it looks like, because the economy is expanding so much, a lot of money is being made. However, there's tons of corruption, and many people are being left behind. You start to really see, as more and more immigrants flood into major cities, really nasty and just horrible conditions in those cities, especially, of course, for the working class people. This is this again to show you the way that artists started to reflect this time period. There's the Ashcan school of art that came out of, or that branches off from Realism, showing sort of the nitty-gritty side of city life. And again, keep this in mind. Compare this back to, if you can remember some of the paintings I showed you from the Romanticist video, how different this is. Starkly different. Some of the major cultural and philosophical forces worth mentioning. The first is Darwinism. So Origin of Species, which is the book that I don't know a ton about the theory of evolution, but at least is sort of the popular source of that theory, was published right around the Civil War, a couple of years before the Civil War broke out. And Darwinism starts to knock away one of the most important pillars of Western civilization, which is the Christian worldview. The idea that Human beings are special. They were created in the image and likeness of God. They look back to the creation story from Genesis. Well, if Darwin's theories are true, and certainly there's research to back all of that up, then it really decenters human beings. It makes us feel like, well, maybe we aren't that special. And some of those Darwinistic ideas about animals and survival of the fittest, things like that, well, they apply to human beings as well, because we are animalistic at our core. So of course this is a very important moment in Western civilization. Is the advent of Darwinism. The other person that you need to know about, and whose theories you need to know about for this time period, is Karl Marx. As a reaction to some of the things I was mentioning earlier about the class divide and the economic inequality during this period, he reacts against that and writes about those issues in the Communist Manifesto. Without going into too much detail, because I'm sure you learned about this in history class, one of his theories is that all of society is controlled by, not controlled, but determined by economics. That the base of society is economics, and that every single one of our institutions, from entertainment, education, military, of course, government, politics, any institution you can think of, is a manifestation of those economic conditions. That even when an artist is, depicting or criticizing economic conditions, they're still doing it as a result of their class and of the underlying economic issues. So he also believes that all of culture is determined by class and economics as well. Not only is culture determined by your economic status, is determined by class, but then it can sort of recodify your place in that class by processing, sort of reprocessing expectations for class structure and reinforcing class structure. So it's not exactly, although some of his theories were optimistic in the sense that he eventually imagined a classless society. For those of us who like to think that there's something special about art, there's something special about culture and literature, it's not really an uplifting view, because he sees all of that as just a product of economics, a product of economic inequality and class and exploitation. So Marx with Darwin, again, they start to knock away these important pillars of Western civilization. Okay, just a couple more slides for you guys. Thanks for hanging in there. So what are some of the tenets of realism? Art should be realistic. It should depict life as it is. There's a quote, "Nothing more or less than the truthful treatment of material." I think that sums up the realist movement quite well. So you tend to see focus on the nitty-gritty details of real life, of working class people, of poor people in the cities, not romanticized, not idealized like the Romanticists did at all. Or there are a lot of novels from this time period about upper class people who behave in extremely animalistic, Darwinistic ways to show that it doesn't matter how wealthy you are, how successful you are, still sort of beholden to your animalistic instincts at the end of the day. So we're going to see something in Huck Finn, this idea of trying to write in a way that's actually reflective of the way people speak. So they'll use colloquial language, and if you haven't read anything by Mark Twain before, it might take a little time to get used to, but he wants to really capture the way that lower class people in the South talk in the 1800s. So He's not going to sugarcoat it. He's going to try to depict that this is how people speak. Okay. There are two main branches of realism. There's a regional writing, which Twain falls under more so than naturalism, and there are also a lot of writers, women writers, who are of this school as well. And the goal here is to try to capture something special about their part of the world before society becomes completely homogenized, which because of the railroads and the population spikes, it's sort of on its way to happening, right? And then there's naturalism, which is inspired by Darwin, and characters in these books are they don't really have any control over their own fates. Either it's determined by heredity. They have to adjust to or get crushed by a brutal environment. They have horrible luck. So Jack London is a big name out of this movement. He wrote White Fang. He also wrote Call of the Wild. Chris McCandless was a huge fan of him. Maybe misunderstanding him in some ways. Theodore Dreiser and Frank Norris wrote more about upper class society, but again, the ways that people in upper class society ultimately behave like animals. And then finally, just a couple other names that, unfortunately, we don't have the time to read all of these authors. I wish we had, but in case you ever see their names elsewhere, you know that they're famous realist writers in American literature. William Dean Howells wrote a great book called The Rise of Silas Lapham about a working class guy who sort of climbs the social ladders in Boston in the late 1800s, but a lot of ugliness and nastiness and violence ensues. Edith Wharton wrote Ethan Frome, which is a fantastic book. Henry James is known for writing these ridiculously long books that I'm not a huge fan of, but he's a famous realist. Stephen Crane, his book The Red Badge of Courage is a realistic and gut-wrenching depiction of being in war and the Civil War. Not glamorized. Main character in that book is scared crapless the entire time as he goes off to war, and sees horrible things, and there's not much glory in that. And then finally Jack London, who we've talked about before in this class. So please make sure that if you didn't, I don't think I told you at the beginning of the video, but please make sure that you did take notes, because you may use those notes on a quiz in class. And that's pretty much it. All right, I will see you guys soon.